In the heart of East Yorkshire stands a house that cannot keep its dead quiet. This is Burton Agnes Hall, a masterpiece of brick, mortar, and bone. Most ghosts are shadows, but here the haunting is physical. It is solid, it is hungry. This is the true story of Anne Griffith, a woman who loved her home so much, she never left. The year was 1601. Sir Henry Griffith was raising a monument of brick and stone from the Yorkshire soil. Of his 3 daughters, the youngest, Anne, was the most devoted. Her sisters sought the world. Anne sought only these walls. It was said among the family that Anne would never rest if she were ever removed from the hall. It was a sentiment they found eccentric. They would soon find it prophetic. One afternoon, while walking near St. John's Well, Anne's devotion met a violent end. Out of the shadows stepped a group of outlaws, hardened cutthroats looking for easy prey. They demanded her valuables, the rings on her fingers, and the Griffith gold. Anne didn't just surrender, she fought. In the chaos, the outlaws delivered a devastating blow to her head. She was left broken in the dirt of the home she worshipped, her life draining into the earth. She was carried back to the hall, but the trauma was absolute. She spent her final days fading in and out of the light. In a final moment of lucidity, Anne didn't ask for comfort. She demanded a pact. "When I am dead," she rasped, "my head must be taken from my body and kept within these walls forever." They promised her they would. It was a vow made to a dying girl, a vow they intended to break the moment she was gone. They chose a traditional burial over her dark request. They chose to bury her whole. It was a mistake they would regret within days. The screaming was about to begin. The funeral took place at the church of Burton Agnes. Anne was lowered into the churchyard soil. Her sisters felt a hollow sense of relief. They believed the earth would keep her quiet. They chose to treat her final request as a product of a broken mind. For 7 days, the house was a tomb of silence. On the 8th night, that silence didn't just break, it shattered. Doors flew open and slammed with unnatural force. Furniture was hurled across rooms by invisible hands. Deep, guttural groans began to echo through the corridors. The household staff could not endure the terror. By the next morning, every servant had fled the hall. Then, the screams began. It was a sound of agonizing, unearthly betrayal. The vibrations were felt in the very masonry of the house. The sisters realized their broken promise had a price. They summoned the vicar of Burton Agnes and Sir William St. Quentin. The vicar's suggestion was grim. Open the coffin. It was the only answer any of them had. In the darkness of the night, they returned to her grave. The heavy soil was cast aside with frantic haste. The wooden lid groaned as it gave way. Inside, the body was an affront to nature. Anne's body lay peaceful and uncorrupted, as if sleeping. But her head was no longer part of her body. It was severed, stripped of all flesh, and completely skeletal. It was a terrifying confirmation of her dying demand. They took the skull and fled the consecrated ground. As the bone entered the house, the noise vanished. The screaming died in an instant. Anne was home. The promise, broken in grief, had been kept in terror. For a generation, the skull of Anne Griffith remained a macabre fixture of the hall. But as the sisters who made the promise died out, the memory of the terror began to fade. To the new staff, the bone was not a sacred ward, it was a grisly nuisance. One afternoon, a maidservant decided the relic had stayed within the walls long enough. As a cart of manure passed beneath her window, she threw the skull directly onto the load. The reaction from the house was instantaneous and violent. The hall shook as if struck by a physical blow. Outside, the horses were struck rigid. Despite the driver's whip, the wagon would not move a single inch. The maid confessed in a panic. The moment the skull was taken back inside, the horses moved off as if nothing had happened. The physical weight of the curse was now undeniable, but later owners still sought a way out. One of the Boynton family, who later inherited the estate, attempted a garden burial. This time, the house didn't shake. It mourned. Groans and wails began to echo through the empty rooms, so persistent that sleep became impossible for the family. Driven by the unrelenting sound, Boynton was forced to return to the garden and dig her up. It was finally accepted that the skull was a part of the house's anatomy. To hide the grisly sight without triggering a revolt, the family decided to wall it in. They chose a secret niche, sealing the relic behind the wood paneling and masonry. They hoped that by keeping her within the structure, they could finally find peace. Anne Griffith remained, a silent observer behind a few inches of stone. Over the centuries, the location of her niche became a closely guarded family secret. In 1953, the Yorkshire Evening Post documented an account that proved Anne was still active. A guest at a dinner party noticed a woman in an unusual dress standing behind two chairs. Assuming it was a maid, the guest looked away. When she looked back, the figure had vanished into thin air. The house was at peace, but only because it was being obeyed. The bone was in the brick. The brick was in the house. Centuries have passed since Anne Griffith was walled into the house she loved. Today, the hall is a destination for history lovers, but the skull remains its most famous tenant. Over time, skeptics and historians have tried to locate the exact niche where the bone rests. Some believe it is hidden behind a door on the first landing of the main staircase. Others point to a cavity in the Great Hall itself. The current owner confirms the skull is still here, built into one of the old walls, likely the Great Hall. Throughout the 1900s, investigators arrived with notebooks, determined to solve the mystery of the Screaming Skull. They waited in the dark, listening for the groans that had terrified generations of residents. While some sought logic, others found only unexplained disturbances near the suspected walls. Accounts from this era often mention the Blue Lady, an apparition believed to be Anne, watching over the state bedroom. Legend holds that the skull isn't just hidden, it's an essential part of the structure. Tradition warns that if the wall is ever dismantled, the screaming will return to reclaim the hall. Even today, visitors report a heavy, watchful atmosphere in the quietest corners of the house. They speak of the sudden, unexplainable scent of lavender or violets in rooms that have been locked for days. Records from the early 1600s remind us that this wasn't a haunt of choice, it was a haunt of necessity. Every historical attempt to move the bone to consecrated ground ended in chaos. The promise made to Anne Griffith was a binding contract of the soul. The present owners have no intention of breaking it. They choose not to search for the bone. For them, it is not about fear, but about respect for a woman who refused to be forgotten. The legend has become a permanent part of the Yorkshire identity. But for those who walk the halls after the tourists have gone home, the atmosphere remains thick with a lingering, silent presence. The Screaming Skull hasn't screamed in decades. Not because the spirit has moved on, but because the terms of her pact are being met. She is exactly where she said she would be, within these walls, forever. Every haunting has a core, a reason why the spirit refuses to settle into the quiet of the past. For Burton Agnes, that core is a physical object, a piece of bone that acts as a spiritual anchor for the entire estate. Skeptics have long argued that the screaming was merely the settling of ancient timber, or wind whistling through stone. But these theories fail to explain the mechanical precision of the events. The wagon that would not move, the house that shook only when the bone was removed. To investigate the Burton Agnes skull is to realize that this isn't just a ghost story. It's a story of ultimate agency. Anne Griffith lived in an era where a woman's identity was often dictated by others. Her home was not just property, it was the only thing she had built her entire self around. In life, she was a victim of a random, brutal act of violence. In death, she became the most powerful force in the house. Across history, we find cursed objects that demand to be feared. But Anne's skull is different. It demands to be home. It is the ultimate load-bearing ghost. If the bone leaves, the peace of the hall collapses. There is a profound irony in the fact that one of England's most beautiful homes is held together by a pact with a skeleton. The current owners understand this. They live in a shared space, a quiet coexistence between the living and the unyielding. The screaming ended each time the terms were finally met, and returned every time they were ignored. Burton Agnes remains a monument to a single stubborn will, a reminder that some promises are stronger than the grave. In the end, the truth of Burton Agnes isn't found in the sightings or the sounds. It is found in the silence, a silence that was bought with a piece of bone and 4 centuries of obedience. Griffith is home.